thank you so much for that warm introduction. And also thank you for being here today. I know in talking with people, especially with the week that we've had and just the year that we've had, a lot of people are feeling really overwhelmed, and it's really heartening to be with a group of people that are actively working to uphold the foundations of our democracy, taking it very seriously what's happening nationally, and then also getting involved in local elections, not just the 22nd LD race, but also down ballot elections and candidates, which we have in our community that are really, really great. So thank you so much for being active, for signing that pledge. I'm very concerned about the results of the election and also continued civil unrest. And quite frankly, as my role as Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Olympia, how we're going to address and handle that. And we are in talks about how to do that right now. I'll keep my opening remarks somewhat short because I would love the opportunity to talk with you all, answer questions that you might have. So for those of you that don't know me, I think I might know most people, but I currently serve as the Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Olympia. I was first elected in 2015 and re-elected last fall. And I have a history of being an organizer. It was the first job I ever had, was organizing in politics for SEIU 775 on initiative I-1163. That's how I got my start, cut my teeth. That was the initiative that professionalized the workforce of home care workers and also required federal background checks so we can ensure that those that are going into the homes of the vulnerable are safe and that they have clear background checks, not just a state, but a federal background check. I then went on to work for former Representative Chris Rakedahl. I'm also a former planning commissioner for the City of Olympia, a former board member of the nonprofit GRUB, which helps empower at-risk youth in our community. And since serving on the Olympia City Council, my very first year, I signed on and endorsed Opportunity for Olympia, which was a progressive tax on high income earners that would have funded college education for Olympia students. That was challenged, or it was put towards an initiative, and it was not passed by the City of Olympia voters. That same year, I sponsored the city's sanctuary city resolution. As soon as the current president was elected, I took action on that, and within 1 month in December of 2016, we unanimously passed that, and we've worked diligently to continue advocating for the civil rights of our undocumented immigrant neighbors. I also led the Home Fund campaign, and affordable housing, homelessness are issues that are near and dear to my heart and that I've been working on for 5 years. And I have a lot of ideas about how we can address that at the state level. And I'm running for this seat because, we have an affordability crisis that's impacting Thurston County residents. 46% of them are rent cost burdened, meaning they're spending a third or more of their rent on housing. We also have lack of quality health care for Olympia and Thurston County. I'm a proponent of Medicare for all, and at the state level, I think that there's more that we can be doing to help bridge that gap for folks that are not eligible for the Affordable Care Act expansion and folks that earn too much money for that. And then also having our own Medicare for all in Washington state. I'm really excited about the opportunity to advocate for that. Also, climate change, we have to be proactive about how we're going to address that issue, having a clean fuel standard. I also think how we price carbon, making sure that polluters pay. I'm also very proponent of progressive taxation going into this next legislative session. We did just get a revenue forecast that brings down the deficit that we were looking at by about half, which is hopeful, but we still need meaningful relief from the federal government, and we're still talking about billions of dollars into a deficit. So recently, the Office of Financial Management directed state agencies to come forward with 15% cuts as an exploratory measure for how they would actually deal with a deficit. And unfortunately, those programs and services are discretionary funding from the state, because so many funding expenditures that we have are dedicated. We have to spend the money on them, like K through 12 education, for example. So the ones that we're looking at are things like developmental disabilities services, maternity care, infant case management, adult dental for those that are on Medicaid. And what I'm going to be saying when I get to the legislature, knock on wood, when I get there, hopefully, is that we need to be getting meaningful relief from the federal government to help states and local governments with their deficits. We need to be looking at progressive taxation and reform of our tax code before we even have a conversation about cuts. And when that conversation happens, equity has to be at the table, because those programs and services that they're talking about cutting disproportionately help support people of color, marginalized individuals, disadvantaged folks. Those are not the cuts that we need to be making during a global pandemic. So we have our work cut out for us, and Representative Dolio has been a tremendous advocate for the 22nd. She has been an effective lawmaker, and those are incredibly big shoes to fill. So I am hesitant to even put myself, it's hard to run for the same office as someone that you respect so much. But I definitely want to continue the progressive work of the 22nd District. And in this race, we do have, a juxtaposition between a Republican candidate that has a very different idea about the future of the 22nd District. I was just on a coffee with Ken earlier this week where Mr. Pierpoint acknowledged he doesn't believe that climate change is actually impacted by human-caused greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions. So we have some serious work to do. We need to elect a legislator that's progressive, that has a progressive record, and that will fight for working families, seniors, and our most vulnerable, and our environment. And that's what I aim to do. I would be happy to answer questions that you have about specific policies, stances that I have, the next legislative session, and then there's some volunteer opportunities I would love to chat with you about as well.
Thank you very much. I do have, we're going to need people to stay muted where I can ask questions, if that's okay. If you got a question, we'd like you to please type it into the chat and put a Q in front of it. And anyway, I do have some questions here, just kind of the ones you ask about. It's you have identified taxation as one of your main goals if elected. How can we make Washington State's regressive tax system more progressive?
Well, it would be great if we could have an income tax. That's going to require a supermajority for the legislature, and it continues and remains to be a controversial issue. Unfortunately, that will require a coalition of stakeholders like labor, all different environmental folks really working towards that. I think in the near term, things that I'm hearing about right now are like a CEO wealth tax on the 16 billionaires in Washington State. I think the narrow scope of that is something that wouldn't scare most voters. They would think these are folks that are making a profit during a global pandemic, and really illustrates the wealth gap in our state. We can also do things like capital gains tax. In the past, we've already done tax on mansions and high property, high value real estate. We could go even further with that. I'm also interested in things like payroll tax, or this is separate, but also going towards a really good cause and helping with something we need right now. Former Speaker Chop has an idea about how we can get access to childcare by doing like the Long-Term Care Act that they just passed, and Family Leave Act, which is a payroll tax that everyone would pay into, and it would help provide for early learning education and childcare in Washington State, which I think is a really great idea. I'm a huge proponent of reforming our tax code. We have over 660 tax breaks in Washington State, and the cumulative impact of that is about 1 year operating expenses for the state budget. We have now, today, if you want to pass a tax break, you have to demonstrate that there's a mutual benefit that everyone in our state will get. What's the public good that's achieved for this public benefit that we're giving up in our tax break? And many of the tax breaks that we have on the books have been there for decades, and it's really hard to take them away once they're there. But there's a tax work group that's co-chaired by Representative Noel Frame. So they're looking at how we can actually go through and make it more equitable. And then also things like looking at the B&O tax, because it's bipartisan. We're going to need to get Republicans on board, and the B&O is something that is not progressive in my opinion. And so that could be a potential. So those are two long-term and short-term ideas that I have.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm all aboard on changing the BO tax. I'm retired, but I was a business owner for 30 years here. I could never understand it. I called it the bankrupt and not a business tax, but that didn't happen to our business. So it needs reform to something fierce. I can guarantee that. So this is a little backup here on this next question. FutureWise has launched its Washington Can't Wait campaign, which is targeting the 1990 Growth Management Act for needed modernization. Specifically, the goal is to implement updates to include: 1, requirements for city and county jurisdictions to provide for affordable housing; 2, adaptations to climate change; and 3, provisions for social and racial equity in land use development. Representative Joe Fitzgibbons, Chair of the Environmental and Energy Committee, and Senator Davina Dewar are sponsoring and promoting this bill. I will be lobbying you on this bill when you take office, and we would like to know what your stance on it is.
Are you saying that you, John, will be lobbying me?
No, OI.
Oh.
Well, I was on the state county legislative, last, so it could be me. But
great. Okay, so Olympia Indivisible is supporting this. Sorry, my dog. That you are speaking my language. I absolutely support taking a look. We run a risk when we open up that Growth Management Act, because there are folks on the other side that have really different ideas about how we need to move forward. But there is a definite lack of accountability for cities to address and create affordable housing. Also, climate change isn't even factored in. What was the Growth Management Act passed in the early 90s? And I can't remember the last part that you mentioned, but I'll just talk about the first two for now. I would love to see cities, right now the Growth Management Act stipulates that you have to plan for future growth of your city. We have comprehensive plans. We talk to our communities about how we're going to do that, but there's no requirement that we actually have a plan for the housing to be available. So what I would love to see is, because I know that cities, in my role as a city council member, cities are really opposed to having the state mandate things like how much housing you have. I think a good start would be having an assessment of how much what's the composition of your housing stock currently, and then have an assessment of, okay, if this is where your baseline is, and based on your comprehensive plan and what your future projection for population growth, that gap of how much do you need to fill, and then you have to allow for the zoning to actually have it occur. Because what we have right now is cities planning theoretically about future growth and how they're going to accommodate that. But when the rubber meets the road, there's nothing in their plans that they're required to actually have the zoning to enable it to happen. And cities can't go in and just build the housing. They don't have enough revenue for that. Some are doing it a little bit like we are with our home fund. But what they absolutely have to do is allow that type of housing to be built. Like, that's the foundation, allowing it to happen. And I also know, because of my role as a city council member, that is land use and zoning are very controversial topics in a lot of communities. That's right. The last part of your that 3-tier is equity. And there's a direct link between land use and equity. Obviously, I'm sure everyone knows that, but I don't think it's talked about enough. So if you look at the history of redlining, where it came from and how it evolved, it was really, like so many forms of racism in our country, it evolved and became kind of, something that they didn't talk about. They didn't explicitly state that it was racism, but it was also a product of the 60s and how we kind of grouped everything in different places. And but it became zoning to allow only single family neighborhoods. And most people that could afford a single family home were white individuals. So if you look at most cities in Washington state today, the vast majority of them only allow single family housing. And that is tricky when we're running out of land and we have a Growth Management Act that says you need to build in urban areas, not in the green rural areas, because we want to preserve that for farmland and green space, which we absolutely need to do. But then there's this, we're stuck because cities aren't allowing growth to happen. And what I think is, cities can be proactive and, they can have design review. They can have, discussions about cottage housing, ADUs, duplexes, row houses. I mean, there's all different kinds of housing that can look, funky and unique, or, there are roles for the community to play in what it looks like. But we have to allow for it to be built. Also the trends, when you look at, and so on equity, I work in healthcare. Let me finish this first. We know that where you live impacts your health and your long-term economic outcome. So if you live in an area that you feel safe to go and enjoy recreation, you live near parks, you're going to be healthier. If you have really good schools, if you live close to your job and you have less time to commute, you can spend more time with your family. So where you live and the neighborhood that you live in is inextricably linked to your health. And we don't want to be depriving people from that, and especially on an equity basis. And when you look at that historical wrong, we want to make sure everyone has that opportunity. So that's something that I'm very, very focused on, and I'm very excited to work on. And I'm really happy to hear that bill is being sponsored already. In terms of climate change, how we build our cities is really linked to climate change. And when I talk about climate change, that's one of my primary ways of doing it, because we have to plan for the future now. How people get around, where they live, how close they are to their grocery store, their library, how dependent they have to be on their single vehicle to get places. Those things are going to impact our greenhouse gas emissions and our quality of life. We want to have also people being able to age in place and live in their home forever, for many years to come, or having like a family member in your ADU in your yard, having intergenerational families. So it's really, it crosses so many different intersectionalities, and I'm really excited that those conversations are happening, and I'm excited you're advocating for it, because we're going to need help on that issue for sure.
Thank you. Another question. If you can only pass one bill in your next 2 years, what would this bill do?
Victor, that's a hard question to ask a person like me.
He specializes in that, as you well know.
I have quite a few that I would love to see pass, but I think in terms of what we have to do in order to do all the things that we want to do, passing progressive taxation, I would love to pass that billionaire's tax today, right now. We have to, for not only the reason of ensuring that we have adequate revenue to provide a robust social safety net, to invest in education, to invest in workforce development for jobs that provide a living wage and dignity, all these things, education is so paramount, but also to break that glass ceiling in terms of people's thinking about progressive taxation. And my hope, I know people will say that, and like my opponent says, this is not the time to talk about taxes, but I think this is absolutely the time to talk about taxes, because we're dealing with a situation where even people that have health care can't afford their health care. And we're in a global pandemic. We have people that are falling through the cracks that can't afford to live. They're paying a third of their income on their housing if they even have a job now. The inequitable nature of our tax code impacts everything. And we have to talk about that. And the inequities, when we talk about those services that they're talking about cutting, we're talking about the services that impact the most vulnerable people. And that speaks really loudly. And the reason why we're in this situation and we're looking at those cuts is because our tax code is so regressive. So that would be my number one.
Thank you. And this next question leads right into it. So how can Olympia Indivisible help you pass progressive legislation once you're there in the state capitol legislative building? How can we help you?
We're going to need to hear from you when those hearings happen and come up. And then also when we have, when we know that they're coming up to target specific legislators that are on the fence about progressive taxation. We know who the progressive proponents are, and that's not where our focus should be. It should be on those folks that are on the fence. And I think that, our strength is in our numbers. It's not just Olympia Indivisible, it's you joining a coalition. And I know that the largest labor organizations in Washington state are working right now so we can have a collective voice and we can tell that story about who we're talking about when we talk about investing in our social safety net, who is going to benefit from our public education system, workforce development. We need to put a face to that, and we need to outnumber and outpower the people that have the power, because the last time we had an income tax, or was it the capital gains tax that was on the ballot, progressive taxation, the folks that are opposed have a lot of money to spend, and they use scare tactics and propaganda, and it has worked. So we have to counter that and tell those stories. And I think with Zoom, this legislative session is probably going to happen primarily, electronically. She has too many squeaky toys. So there'll be a really great opportunity for people to get involved on Zoom, and we'll have places for you to come and testify. And I'll be there, and I will let you know as we approach that time with some more specific asks, but just be ready. I know you will. So I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, since Ruby's trying to join, do we have any questions for Ruby? I think she's a golden doodle from the picture I saw.
She's a Labradoodle mini.
Labradoodle, all right.
Yeah.
So, but I don't see any questions for oh, happy dogs make me happy. I like that. That's for sure.
I call her my Prozac puppy because she's constantly, because I live alone. So she just, I had the toy on the table and she snatched it off the table.
So if we have any complaints, we'll send them to your dogs, right? Isn't that the best place for it? They voice them the best, so.
Here we go. Let me say later. Say hi to you. Come here. Say hi.
Oh, I like that toy.
She won't let that thing go.
Cool. So Beth has told us that the Clean Fuels Act is going to be reintroduced along with carbon emission reduction bills. And how proactive will you be to ensure this and other climate change bills get passed?
It's essential. We have to be, I mean, when I say proactive, we have to make this a priority to move as quickly as possible and as proactively as possible. It's not like 10 years ago when we could say, you know, we don't know what the consequences of climate change will be, and we don't know if the predictions are as dire as they say. Because, you know, when they come out with those climate change reports, there's always kind of a range of we don't know. We're seeing those impacts today, and we know how dire, you know, sea level rises. We're in Washington State, we have thousands of miles of coastline where people are susceptible to that. The areas of our state that are impacted by wildfires continue. And I know that Hillary Franz, our Public Lands Commissioner, asked for revenue last year that she didn't get in order to be more proactive with forest management. You know, this is only going to get worse. The air that everything, it will impact every single thing. So we have to put a price on carbon. We have to provide the clean fuel standard. I will be actively advocating for that, working with Representative Fitzgibbons about that. In our LD in 22, we have, you know, I know I can rely on you to come and testify for that. And we have the support for it because the vast majority of people in Thurston County and in LD 22 and I think polling statewide believe climate change is real and that we need to be proactive to address that. My concern as we do that is ensuring that low income people that we have subsidies, you know, as we transition into things like no longer allowing gas to be in new construction, eliminating gas vehicles, hopefully like California by 2035, and doing these things. You know, we're going to have to make sure that the folks that are the lowest income, that they have subsidies and supports, because we don't want the folks that have to drive the furthest to work because they can't afford to live in the city that they work in because it's too expensive, are going to be paying a disproportionate amount. So it's really essential that we target those industries that are making the profits off of the greenhouse gas carbon reducing or carbon emissions.
Right. Thank you. And one of the attendees is just giving you a little tip here. Instead of calling it progressive taxation, we all should probably try to call it fair taxation, because that's exactly what you just described. It's really
a good point.
It's fair. It's not what's progressive, regressive, or whatever. It's what's fair for us citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So we can
I'll
remain.
remember that.
Yeah. So we can remain united instead of being divided all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We got a question here about what do you think the legislature needs to do to help clean up the Puget Sound? And I'd say all water quality issues that we have.
You know, the biggest area that I have been familiar with pollution is stormwater management. And I know that we are not coming close to providing enough for stormwater management. And that is something that more impervious surfaces that we have, you know, it's not just the gas that's leaking from cars, it's the brake dust, it's all these different chemicals that are going right into Puget Sound. So we need to make sure that we're funding the clean and safe removal of those through our stormwater management system. And not all cities are doing that. My mom works in water quality for King County, and she can attest to the fact that everyone is at different levels and they are not funding it the way that they need to. That is chiefly the way that I would be thinking about doing that. And then also getting people out of cars, you know, getting to electric vehicles as much as we can do to reduce those toxic chemicals that are going into Puget Sound as much as possible.
All right, thank you. Along that same vein, what action do you think the legislature can take to address, you know, the growing threat of wildfires in our state?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, we have a fabulous Commissioner of Public Lands, Hillary Franz, who has been actively talking with legislators about the threat of climate change and forest fires. And there's much more that we can do to manage the forests that we do have, to remove the brush and the timber that could be fuel. You know, there's a lot of different things, like the beetles that are killing the trees, making them just, you know, able to go up like in smoke quickly. So I think we need to talk to her and say, okay, what is it that you're asking for, and how can we help you, and how can we fund that? Because I know she's had packages in the past that were more comprehensive that she did not get fully funded.
All right, thank you. There's another good question, is how are you going to deal with voters who seem to be increasingly divorced from reality, like QAnon or single family home assessives, so forth? And I'd like that, because how do the rest of us deal with them?
You're talking about psychology and moral psychology, I think, here. And, you know, it is difficult to talk with folks that, you know, it's like talking to a climate change denier. And it's, in my experience, a person that has a position like that, it's about a value for them. It's not about the facts. It's not about data. They have a perception, an idea, and a value, and they're looking for evidence to support it. And we all do this to a certain degree. In my world, I'm dealing with evidence, with data, with metrics, and it's hard to work with folks that aren't able to do that. It's something that I continue to be challenged with. What I try to do is focus on where we have common alignment. And usually there's always some area that we can agree on, and also our values and our vision for a future. You know, I do believe fundamentally that all people want their children to have a better future than they did. And right now in the country that we're in, that is not a given by any means. That's debatable by some people, but at the end of the day, you know, my job in my current role, and then in my future role, hopefully, will be to use my judgment, my knowledge, my evidence and my studies and everything that I can do, the input that I receive from people, talking to subject matter experts, to make the best decision that I can, and to explain to people what led me to come to that decision, and always remain open to talking with people when they disagree or when I disagree with them. That's the best that I can do. And I can't spend a lot of my time trying to convince people to believe basic facts and basic evidence. I just don't have, you know, I would rather focus on the folks that I can work with and accomplish some meaningful change. I'm very action oriented that way. And I understand, you know, I understand people that they have different perspectives. You know, I think like the conversation that I had earlier this week on that show where we had a debate, and, you know, like my opponent fundamentally doesn't believe that we should raise taxes at all, ever. And I just don't, it's a very different, and I can't talk him out of that. We have different opinions. So I believe people have their right to their opinions. And then at the end of the day, I have to make the decision.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. Oh, this is to everybody. It's not really a question, but if you look at chat, there's been put up, it's the website for Jessica, and it actually goes right to the contribute, because we'll say it right now. Why don't you get there and help contribute? If you haven't, donate. We got local candidates that they need as much help as the national ones, and they might not be filling our email boxes full 5 times a day. So make sure you donate to the local candidates, because they're the ones in the worst need as far as I'm concerned. And I think most of us that are here, because that's why we're here. So.
Thank you.
Okay. Besides equity, inclusivity is a challenge with supporting our social safety net programs such as unemployment, Medicaid, and quality discernment skills and education. How do we improve inclusion?
Could that person elaborate a little bit more on what they're talking about when they talk about inclusion in our social safety net and unemployment? I'd love to hear their thoughts on that.
I would too.
This is Christy. That's from me.
Hi, Christy.
And thanks for coming and talking to us. It's nice to hear you directly, unfiltered and all that. So thank you. So I guess what I'm talking about is, besides equal opportunity, whether it's for a job or education or healthcare, there are groups in our state and that don't believe that things like healthcare is available to them because of our history with them, such as some of our tribal nation neighbors and whatnot, that we're not serious about giving them things like healthcare and other things. So how do we bridge the gap with these marginalized communities? And also, I think some of our agricultural workers over in the Yakima, Okanagan area, I think have felt very excluded from things like quality education and healthcare and unemployment.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the context a little bit. And during my day job, I'm a health policy analyst and I work for community health centers in Washington, and they are the largest network of providers for patients on Medicaid. Most providers won't actually accept and take patients that are on Medicaid. And we have a couple of Native American community health centers, and we have health centers in the Yakima Valley, all over Washington state, in the heart of downtown Seattle, very diverse communities. So I'm very familiar with working with different stakeholders. And what I can say is that we have to start with our values, which is when we talk about healthcare, it's healthcare for all. When we talk about economic security, it's economic security for everyone. And we have to be constantly reaching out to those communities. We have a task force at the state level for working with Native American and Indian communities in Washington state, working on healthcare, things like dental therapists. So they actually have the ability, dental therapist is like a mid-level provider in dentistry that allows folks that don't have a doctorate in dentistry to provide a wider range of services to get to the access and get increased access to people. And so in Washington, the only place they're allowed to perform those services is on Indian reservations, Native American reservations. So there have been efforts when they advocate, and they've advocated for that. I think we need to be much more proactive. And I think this next session, equity is going to be something that we're going to be delving deeply into because of the year that we've had talking about institutionalized racism and how that impacts and is woven into every segment of society and our institutions. So there's going to be a lot of work, and every year we get more people in the legislature that are advocating for those issues. Because of the work that I do during my day job, I'm very, very sensitive to wanting to be inclusive. In our Yakima Valley, we have a community health center that provides a tremendous amount of services to patients on Medicaid there. And the governor did provide some funding for those folks that have been impacted by COVID-19 because they were not eligible for those services from the federal government. And we need to do even more to make sure that folks in our community and in our state continue to get services and help and support. So what I can do as a legislator is maintain my commitment to that, make sure that I'm keeping in touch with those organizations that advocate for those constituencies and stakeholder groups, making sure that I'm having those conversations and advocating for that in the committees that I'll be working on. I'm hoping to be on healthcare because I work during my day job on that. So I will be very, very attuned to those issues, and please bring those up during the session so we can make sure that they're a priority.
Okay, thank you.
So right now, from now until the election, how can volunteers best support you?
Yes, so we are really revving up the volunteer opportunities, and not just with our campaign, with also the other campaigns in Thurston County, because we want to make sure that we have a blue wave and we're not taking anything for granted that Washington's a blue state. We know that, but we're going to make sure we're going to put our money where our mouth is. Molly Sullivan is on the line. She is not only my campaign manager, but she is the coordinated campaign manager or coordinated campaign director for our Thurston County efforts. So we're going to have weekly phone banking events for my campaign on Wednesday evenings and on Saturdays at 2. And then we will have weekly lit dropping activities where you can come by the 4th Street office in downtown Olympia and you can get packets of lit. We'll give you all the training that you need and provide you with a list. And then you'll get not only my literature, but other candidates' literature, like hopefully Carolina Mejia, Michael Stedman, both running for county commissioner, future Congresswoman Beth Dolio, and I think some others. And it would be really great to have that because we need to hit as many doors as we can. We're doing safe literature dropping. So that means no knocking on doors, no getting up close and personal. You just drop the lit on the door as close as you can get, and you have no interaction with anybody. And we've been doing this since April, and we haven't had any negative interactions or people that have been concerned. For those of you that don't feel comfortable doing that, then you can make phone calls and phone bank for us, and that would be really helpful too.
Thank you. And I now see that Molly has put that over in the chat. She's got the information right there if people want to look at that. And also while they're scrolling, I see one of our members has said that he will match up to $50 towards Jessica's campaign from other donors if they donate tonight.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
So,
any contribution is greatly appreciated.
okay. Last question I see here is I was at the Democratic office today and very few people there with COVID issues. Some our old ways of election work are not available. What do you think are the actions that would be most effective in this unique election?
I think personally phone banking is extremely effective. The trouble is, it's just a reality. I guess it's not a trouble. When you call, 80% of the calls that you make are to voicemails. So we're leaving voicemails for a lot of people. About 20% of people actually answer their phones because, people are just busy, and it's different when you knock on someone's door, they see you, they're less inclined to just like shut the door in your face because they see a human being there. But when you call, it's different. People are used to telemarketers and it feels a little invasive, I think, to some people. But we're doing both because what they say is that in order for someone to vote for you, it takes 7 touches. And a touch can be reading a letter to the editor, seeing your yard sign, seeing your lit on their doorstep, having an interaction, talking to a neighbor, but it really is repetition in the human brain and hearing that person or seeing something. So when you leave a message, it's valuable. When you talk to someone, it's valuable. I had someone that I called during GOTV in the last 2 weeks before the primary election, and I called her and she said, "Oh, one of your volunteers called me and they couldn't stop saying nice things about you, so I'm voting for you." And so, one of my volunteers that I think it was like a routine volunteer made a mention about how they were volunteering on my campaign. So it really does help to have volunteers that are speaking on behalf of the candidate. You're kind of attesting to their values. And it's also fun for folks to connect, I think, right now with COVID-19.
Okay, thanks again. And I'm going to call this the last question. Are you prepared to work with whomever is elected to Congress from CD10?
I am prepared to work. Beth is going to be prepared to work with people on CD10. I will be prepared to work with legislators across the aisle. I come from a small rural community, Maple Valley, Washington. I think when I was a young person, there was 2,000 people there. People drove their pickup trucks, and they're actually tractors down the street sometimes. I moved to Olympia in 2007 to go to Evergreen and didn't realize how conservative my community was until I moved to Olympia. And so I'm used to working with folks from all different backgrounds. And I know that I might disagree with a person on one policy, but I'm still going to come back to the table on the next one, because in order for me to work for my constituents and be effective, that means I'm going to work with people, even whom I disagree with, on some pretty important and significant issues. These aren't my best friends. These are people that I'm there to work with in order to accomplish something. I also think having worked as a city council person in a nonpartisan position, I work with our current county commissioners, 2 of which are independent. In all honesty, I haven't had a lot of interactions with Commissioner Edwards. But, part of my job currently is doing that. And I really enjoy working with people and different kinds of people. And also our system relies on different people's backgrounds. I don't have that subject matter knowledge of every single issue. It really is how our system works is different people's perspectives, backgrounds, experiences, subject matter expertise all comes together with input from people in our communities, obviously. And that's, we get a better outcome that way. So it's really important to be open to that.
All right, thank you. I really don't have any more questions, and we're kind of out of time anyway, other than if you have a few minutes you want to wrap up and say anything or just say goodbye or whatever. It's up to you right now.
I just want to thank you for your time again. You know, it's so inspiring. I was running a couple errands today and thinking about being on this call, and it just really warmed my heart to know that you all are working. And it is a tough time. It's a tough year. It's kind of depressing. It can feel overwhelming, like we're helpless, and we're not. We have to remain vigilant. We have to remain optimistic about the future and the possibilities that we have for our future, and we have to fight for it. And we have amazing people in our community that are doing that every single day. And there are other people in Washington State that are as well. And I can also attest to the leaders that I see, you know, going to the mat and working for what's best for all of us. So we need you to continue to, you know, pull through this with everyone and also fight for the future that we all deserve. And I'm really, really thankful that you're here and that you had me. And please do keep in touch. Keep my, you know, you can contact Molly if you ever want to get in touch with me, schedule a meeting if there's an issue that you would like to talk about more or you didn't feel comfortable talking about today. And then make sure that you reach out to me during session, and we'll make sure that we get some email updates so we can keep you all in the loop.
All right. Thank you very much. We're just thrilled that you were able to come here, and we're glad we're supporting you. We're going to put you right where you belong, right in the legislative's office in the Capitol building. You've got all the right ideas as far as I'm concerned. So
thank you.
Yeah.